Welcome. This is a talk on René Magritte, an artist who provokes us, makes us think, as well as amuses and troubles us. Every painting is a mystery and there isn't an answer. It's difficult to resist, though, trying to solve the mystery, and I'll suggest interpretations as we go along. But of course, all the interpretations will be wrong because, as Magritte himself said, it is the mystery that illuminates knowledge. Let's begin with this picture, a self-portrait. You might not recognise this as a Magritte, as it's his early period. It's painted in 1923 when he was 25, and it reflects his developing style at the time before he embraced Surrealism, when he was influenced by Impressionism and Cubism. A bit of background about his early years. René Magritte was a Belgian artist, born in 1898. His father was a tailor, possibly also a textile merchant, and his mother was a milliner before they married. And he had two younger brothers, Raymond and Paul. When he was 14, tragedy struck. His mother, Regina, committed suicide by drowning. And there's a story that she was found a month later and her head was wrapped in her dress. And Magritte saw her like this, and that led to him painting many images with heads wrapped. It's a moving and thought-provoking story, but recently it's been discredited as the invention of his nurse. The other point to make at this time is that his father was a womanizer both before and after his wife's suicide, and Magritte is described in his biography as wallowing in pornography. He did badly at school, except in drawing, where he was top of the class, and he left school when he was 14. He started to paint in this surreal manner in 1925, and this is one of his early surrealist paintings called The Lovers. A man and a woman kiss, but their heads are covered in cloth, so they cannot make contact. They're trying to make contact, but each is trapped in his or her own world. Early on, he deals with topics such as isolation and the nature of self and personal identity. Raises questions like, do we really know who anyone is? Or are their true identities hidden by a veil of social expectations? This painting is actually the second version. The first version is this one. The faces are covered, but they're not kissing. Maybe he decided the relationship should be more intimate, as if between a man and woman, perhaps Magritte and his wife. Now, he wrote a lot of letters, and unlike many artists, he did write about his art. He described his paintings as visible images which conceal nothing. They evoke mystery, and indeed, when one sees one of my pictures, one asks oneself this simple question: what does it mean? It does not mean anything, because mystery means nothing either. It is unknowable. End quote. So, he's asking us to see this painting as two people in a landscape with their heads wrapped in cloth and nothing more. Or if there is more, it's a mystery that I think deserves contemplation. But his paintings seem to call out for interpretations. So as we go along, I will suggest some possible interpretations. But before then, a bit more about his life. He dropped out of school the year after his mother died, and a few years later he enrolled himself at the Brussels Academy of Fine Arts. But after a couple of years, he dropped out because he felt there was nothing left to learn. He became a designer at a wallpaper factory and then did sketches for advertisements. And then in 1922, he saw this, a reproduction of Giorgio de Chirico's painting, The Song of Love. And it had an enormous influence on him. When he first saw the work, he said it brought him to tears. And he said, "One of the most moving moments of my life, my eyes saw thought for the first time." Later in 1927, he met de Chirico in Paris, and he continued to be his main artistic influence for the rest of his life. I mentioned his wife. This is a photograph of him with Georgette Berger on their wedding day in 1922. He'd met her 9 years before at a fair in Châtelet, where they both grew up. They were both about 15 when they first met, but they lost contact and didn't meet again until 1920. And then she became his model, muse, and then his wife. She, incidentally, was also his business manager. She played a crucial role in his career and helped him promote his work and managed his exhibitions. And their close partnership was integral to his success. As I said, he became interested in Surrealism in 1925, and in 1929 he became officially associated with the Surrealist group and remained a member throughout the 1930s. His work from 1925 onwards increasingly aligned with their principles, unexpected juxtapositions, dreamlike imagery and so on, but he always had a different approach to the other Surrealists. And by the late 1930s, he had many disagreements, particularly with the leader, André Breton, and he left the group in 1946. This is another early work, The Menaced Assassin of 1927. It's a scene of an apparent murder with people observing from behind doors and windows. There was a popular crime fiction series before World War I called Fantomas, which the eponymous hero hid his identity, often by disguise or wearing a mask. And this painting is based on the film The Murderous Corpse, which is based on that book series. The film was first released in 1913. And in the film, there is a scene where two detectives hide either side of a doorway. Magritte wanted to create a similar mystery. He said, quote, "I take care, as far as possible, to make only paintings that arouse mystery with the precision and enchantment necessary for the life of ideas." End quote. So he is implying here that the paintings arouse mystery, but he paints them in such a way that he gives rise to the life of ideas, as he calls it. In other words, the mystery that he shows evokes in one's mind possibilities and ideas. He loved mystery, incidentally, and illusions, and they deeply influenced his work. And by loving mystery, I mean he would attend magic shows and he would incorporate elements of illusion in his art, reflecting his belief that art should be a form of magical thinking. Here's an example. An artist is painting a woman, but she's not on a canvas, but seems to be coming to life as he paints. Incidentally, the model and many of his paintings of women are modelled by his wife, Georgette, who was also an artist and trained at the same school as Magritte, although not at the same time. The painting reminds me of an ancient myth, the sculptor Pygmalion, who prayed to the goddess Aphrodite to bring his statue of a beautiful woman to life, and in response, his statue Galatea was granted life. So here, Magritte is blurring the boundary between art and reality and exploring the artist's yearning to transcend the limitations of art. I thought I'd show you this to in a way add to the mystery. This is a photograph taken at the time. It's described as a study for the final painting. However, by enhancing the photograph, you can see it's not a painting of a woman, it's a photograph of a real woman, and Magritte is holding his brush against her arm. He seems to have intentionally recreated the painting. Maybe his aim in having the photograph taken was to further confuse the relationship between representation and reality. We come on to one of his most famous paintings, 1929, The Treachery of Images. And we can see it as a comment on many of his paintings. It shows an everyday pipe, and underneath is written, "Ceci n'est pas une pipe." This is not a pipe. Incidentally, I should mention that all of his paintings had French titles, and I've generally only provided the English translation, as this talk is in English. So this painting, for example, is called La Trahison des Images, the Treachery of Images. Again, he's playing with reality and images, but this time he makes it clear that this is not what it appears to be, a pipe, but a painting of a pipe, very different. It's a symbol, a representation of a pipe, like the word pipe itself. Magritte actually had a long life interest in philosophy, and this might be a comment on the nature of words as signifiers, because the painting touches on concepts described in the work of Ferdinand de Saussure, who's a foundational figure in linguistics and semiotics. And it also anticipates ideas developed by Ludwig Wittgenstein and Michel Foucault. Foucault actually wrote an essay called "This is Not a Pipe" in 1973, and he was intrigued by the painting's philosophical implications and how it challenges our understanding of representation. Incidentally, there's another angle to this. Magritte was known for his chain-smoking habit. He famously stated that his works were made from cigarettes, and he often used pipes and cigarettes as props in his paintings. And he was well known as a smoker. His heavy smoking was a notable part of his daily life and his personal image. This is the false mirror. We see an enormous eye without lashes, with a cloud-filled sky replacing the iris and a solid black pupil in the centre. Now the sky evokes thoughts of the infinite, the unknown, and the mysterious, hinting at perhaps at the vastness of the human imagination. It's also fleeting and changeable, which, like our minds, is never fixed, always changing. The title, The False Mirror, suggests he's commenting on the limitations of human vision. What we see is not like a mirror, an undistorted image of the world. It's highly subjective and interpreted. We process what we see. In fact, we now know our visual system continually categorises the world and interprets what we see based on what we know. There's no pixel by pixel representation of what we see inside our brain. Our optic nerves transmit information about edges and areas, and they transmit that as a series of electrical signals, and the brain assembles these into symbols, partly driven by what we expect to see. Indeed, a false mirror. This is the interpretation of dreams, which refers to a famous book by Sigmund Freud, published 5 years before in 1930. Now, we know Magritte was sceptical of Freud's interpretation of dreams, and we see in this painting that each object, apart from the valise, is mislabelled. Possibly he's criticising the way Freud assigns easy meanings to objects in dreams. In 1927, Magritte and his wife moved to Paris, where he met the founders of Surrealism, André Breton and Paul Éluard, and they were fascinated by Freud's ideas about the unconscious, but Magritte was less convinced. He focused on the mystery and the ambiguity of images rather than exploring their personal psychology. He used everyday objects in his paintings, as here, and this could be a way of emphasising the intrinsic mystery of the world without resorting to Freudian explanations of hidden desires or traumas. I mentioned just now Ferdinand de Saussure. His linguistics theory distinguishes between the object, he called the signified, and its name, the signifier. And Magritte shows here how this link is arbitrary. And he creates a sense of cognitive dissonance by correctly labelling one of those objects. We expect them all to be wrong, but surprised and perhaps unsettled and puzzled by one being correct. Maybe he's saying that although arbitrary, the connection between word and object can be useful. Or maybe he's just playing with us for fun. We know he had a sense of humour. Magritte once received a letter from an admirer who claimed to have found a lost Magritte painting. It turned out to be fake, but Magritte, known for his sense of humour, as I said, responded politely and expressed appreciation for the creativity of the forger. So they went to Paris in 1927. They returned to Brussels in 1930. And although they travelled around to his exhibitions and elsewhere, their home going forward from 1930 onwards would always be in Brussels or the suburbs of Brussels. And it was in the 1930s that his work began to get more recognition, partly due to the efforts of his art dealer, Paul Collinet, who helped promote his work and arranged exhibitions for him. However, needs to be said that although he was getting some recognition, through the 1930s and 40s, he wasn't selling many works. He faced extreme financial difficulties on occasions. His work wasn't well received commercially, and he struggled to make a living, and to support himself, he took on various commercial art projects. He designed advertisements and posters, for example, and made money in other ways, as we'll see later. A cage. A cage like this typically holds a bird, but here it contains a pre-bird, an egg. So he's inverting our expectations, challenging our views of what is natural, playing with inversion and paradox. The way he put it was, quote, "New and astonishing poetic secret that arose from the idea of juxtaposing related as opposed to unrelated things," end quote. So the work juxtaposes confinement and freedom. The egg symbolises potential, as it will eventually become a bird, a symbol of freedom, but it is already confined in a cage before it's even born. And there is a human desire for freedom, but our society, our psychology constrains us. And for an artist, the necessities of life constrain their creative freedom. Now, the title, Elective Affinities, refers to a novel by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe of 1809 with the same name. The novel is based on Goethe's human chemical theory, which compares human relationships with chemical reactions. Some people are drawn together and others repel each other, often in ways beyond their control. And that's what the novel is about, how two couples meet and their relationship develops in ways beyond their control because it's determined by their human chemistry. And the painting captures, I think, the essence of this theory, the way that external forces have a great impact on our ability to act. Although we always feel free, there's always attractions of forces we cannot control. Hence, human beings may feel as though they're caged because of their inability to take full control of the circumstances of their life. In fact, Magritte wrote about this work. He said, "One night I woke up in a room with a cage with a bird sleeping in it. A magnificent error caused me to see an egg in the cage instead of the vanished bird. I then grasped a new and astonishing poetic secret, for the shock which I experienced had been provoked precisely by the affinity of two objects, the cage and the egg, to each other, which previously this shock had been caused by my bringing together two objects that were unrelated." Note, so in this painting, he's bringing together two related objects, although to us, I think, you might see them as surprisingly unrelated, except insofar as, of course, the egg is a precursor to the bird, which is commonly associated with the cage. And also it's worth looking at the details. If you look carefully at the top left of the cage, you'll see that it's in front of the frame, but at the lower left, it's behind the frame. Also, the cage hangs from a hook, but it's resting on a support beneath it, so the hook is in a way unnecessary. Another painting that is to do with artistic representation. In fact, he painted 3 similar paintings and a drawing entitled The Human Condition. And this was painted in 1933. And one of the devices he uses is to hide something, such as a face hidden behind an apple, which we'll see later, or a head hidden under a cloth. And here we see a scene outside a window hidden by a painting of what we could imagine is the same scene. And Magritte wrote about this work. "In front of a window seen from inside a room, I placed a painting representing exactly that portion of the landscape covered by the painting. Thus the tree in the picture hid the tree behind it outside the room. For the spectator, it was both inside the room within the painting and outside in the real landscape." So the painting on the easel represents reality, and yet the reality that it represents is part of the same painting. So it's no more real. So do we see the world as it is, or as we are conditioned to see it? Is what we see like a painting, a particular view of the world that we create? Neuroscientists now tell us that a large part of our visual recognition is projecting what our minds expect to see. I had an example of this yesterday. I saw 2 logs floating down the Thames, and it took me a couple of seconds to realise I was looking at the wake of 2 ducks swimming down the river. The window is also a metaphor of how our perceptions are framed and limited. What we observe is partial and incomplete, and the frame is a symbol for the boundaries of our knowledge. So, Magritte is reflecting on the treachery of images, as he has done in his painting of a pipe, which is of course called The Treachery of Images. We move on to the following year, 1934, when he painted this, The Rape, one of his most controversial works. It's seen by some as deeply misogynistic, understandably, because a woman's face, the most personal and expressive part of the body, is reduced to her sexual body parts. And the title, The Rape, further heightens this interpretation, as it suggests violence and the violation of the woman's identity, turning her into a mere object of desire rather than a whole person. Alternatively, some critics argue he painted this as a criticism of the way women are seen by society. So rather than promoting misogyny, its aim is to provoke a conversation about how women are seen and treated in society. So it's a criticism of society. I think at this point I should add another element to this. His biographer, Alex Danchev, in his book Magritte, A Life, tells us he was deeply interested in pornography all of his life and collected pornographic postcards and prints. In fact, where he lived in Brussels suburbs from the 1930s to the 1950s, his dentist showed pornographic films in his attic to a small group, including Magritte and his friends. The dentist also kept a tame bird of prey, which roamed around the house, which Magritte, of course, relished as what he called glimpses of the always more successful surrealism of everyday life. So having said that about one aspect of his personal life, I still think he may be intentionally ambiguous and confrontational with this painting, forcing himself and viewers to confront uncomfortable issues surrounding objectification and identity. This painting depicts a pair of leather boots that are gradually morphing into human feet, seamlessly transitioning from footwear to flesh. Now, Magritte asks us not to speculate on symbols and inner meaning. He said, quote, "If one looks at a thing with the intention of trying to discover what it means, one ends up no longer seeing the thing itself, but of thinking of the question that it raised." End quote. He wants us to look at the thing itself that is painted. In a way, that doesn't mean there should be no interpretations. It means that interpretation should arise and we should look at the thing itself that's represented rather than thinking of the questions it raised. Having said that, if we look at this painting, I've taken this as one example of expressing some of the many interpretations that are made for every one of his paintings. And rather than going through 10 different interpretations for every painting I've shown you, I've generally stuck to one interpretation, one or two. But I thought with this painting, I'd quickly describe a few of the different interpretations that can be made of any one of his works. Let's begin with The Red Model, the title. It may have no meaning or relation to the painting. However, it could refer to the rise of communism in the 1930s, or associated with red. as an ideology or model for society that attempts to shape human nature. In fact, Magritte joined the Communist Party in 1932, but he grew disillusioned because of their rigid view of art and the necessity for communist artists, to paint in a socialist realism style. And so he left the party, although he did continue to hold left-wing political views throughout his life. So that's one way of looking at it. But of course, there's another way. The red could refer to the blood and toil of the capitalist worker, and the model to the industrial model, where the boots symbolise the tools of labour and production. Looking at it a different way, a second interpretation, he's blurring the boundary between the human body and the objects around us, and human identity is partly shaped by the objects we use, the objects we wear. And here the boots are being humanised, or alternatively, the human body is being turned into a manufactured object. Third, he may just be playing with our ideas by turning something familiar, the boots, into something strange and unsettling. He's disrupting our expectations to make us think and look again at the world in a new way. Fourth, he may be commenting on the tension between the natural world, represented by the feet, and the man-made inorganic world that we are all creating around us. Fifth, the transformation of the feet could be a metaphor of how we've become alienated from our bodies or identities through our interaction with the modern world and its technology and its objects. We are shaped by and emerging with our tools and technologies, and so losing or struggling to find our identity. 6, our identities are, of course, constantly changing and transforming, and the metaphor of metamorphosis is a common motive in Surrealist art. Our external identities, our clothes and technologies, become so intertwined with ourselves that they alter our sense of self, and we become defined by our clothes and our material goods. 7th, the boot symbolises footwear and civilization, and the bare feet the natural human form, and civilization is shaping and transforming our natural selves in ways we're not even aware is happening. And Magritte is drawing our attention to the gradual loss of our natural selves. 8, in Freudian psychoanalysis, fetish objects often stand in for deeper psychological needs or desires, so the painting could be seen as exploring the blurring of desire and function, where an ordinary object like a shoe, a functional object, becomes imbued with emotional and symbolic meaning and desire, the foot. 9th, footwear is an everyday object, yet he reveals a mystery behind such everyday objects. He's asking us to reconsider the familiar relationship between footwear and the human foot, and therefore the choices we make regarding ourselves, our bodies and our artificial adornments and enhancements. And finally, our identity is constructed by the roles we play and the objects we use. By blending the object and the body, he's suggesting we can never be natural or autonomous, but are always shaped by external forces. So you can see how any of these interpretations could be expanded and elaborated, as they often are. However, Magritte, as I said, did not want us to engage in such speculation, as he felt we'd lose sight of what is in front of us. Although, I need to add, many art historians would follow the French philosopher Roland Barthes and say the meaning of a work of art is not determined by the author's intention, but rather by the viewer's interpretation. We see here a man, presumably a philosopher, as it's called, the philosopher's lamp. He has a melancholic expression, and melancholia was, of course, historically associated with genius and deep thought. But here the man is absurd. His nose has grown into his pipe, perhaps a reference to Pinocchio's growing nose and to lying. And Magritte, remember, was addicted to smoking, so he may be referring to lying to himself about his flaws and addictions. And the nose entering the pipe and the pipe entering the mouth suggests a closed loop, a philosopher so tied up in his own thoughts he misses the truth signified by the endless light of reason represented by the candle on the table. And the candle itself seems to have grown up like a living thing and is illuminating the face of the philosopher, but the philosopher is turning away from the light of reason. One possible interpretation. It was in 1936, the year this was painted, that Magritte began an affair with a woman named René, a pseudonym for her, a woman whose real name we don't know, but some believe it was Sheila Legge. Now, Sheila Legge was a successful British surrealist artist and a performance artist, and I'm showing her here enacting a figure from a Salvador Dali painting. And Magritte arranged for his friend and art dealer Paul Collinet to entertain his wife, to distract her from his affair. But this, in turn, led to an affair between his dealer and his wife Georgette. Despite the challenges from both affairs, their marriage survived. They reconciled in 1940 and they remained together for the rest of their lives. And his affair didn't become public knowledge and didn't fundamentally alter his artistic career. This is his not to be reproduced, an enigmatic painting that raises questions about identity, perception and reality. We see a man standing in front of a mirror, but the reflection doesn't show his face as we'd expect. It's the same view we see. It could symbolise the unknowability of the self, indicating our perception of who we are is always incomplete or distorted. The mirror, which of course traditionally reflects truth or reality, is now showing something unexpected, raising questions about how accurately we can see ourselves. Incidentally, the book on the shelf is La Grande Espérance. It's a French translation of Charles Dickens' novel Great Expectations, and the book adds a literary reference which reinforces themes of identity and self-perception, because both the book and the painting are concerned with appearance versus reality, misconceptions and illusions, self-discovery and transformation. The model for the man in the painting is someone he knew. During the early stages of his career, the British surrealist Edward James allowed Magritte to stay rent-free in his house in London when Magritte studied architecture and painted. And it's Edward James, who's featured here. As his work began to gain more recognition in the 1930s, partly the efforts of his art dealer, Paul Collinet, he managed to gain entrance to a number of several important surrealist exhibitions, including the International Exhibition of Surrealism in Paris in 1938, a landmark event for the surrealist movement. Although, having said that, his art wasn't well received commercially, didn't sell. So he became better recognised amongst the surrealists But in the 1930s, in fact 1930s and 1940s, he faced financial difficulties, struggled to make a living solely from painting, and took on various other projects. This is time transfixed. There's a train, smoke coming from the train, emerging from a fireplace, entirely out of context, an extraordinary intrusion into the ordinary, raising questions about how we perceive time and reality. The mirror also introduces a play on reflection and perspective. The train suggests progress, technology, and the clock, the passage of time. The fireplace is an object traditionally associated with warmth and domesticity. So there's a surreal contrast that emphasises a collision of the old and the new, the mundane and the modern. Magritte was starting to become known, although not commercially successful, and tensions developed between him and the leader of the Surrealists, André Breton. Those tensions grew, and by 1946 he was officially excluded from the Surrealist group. One point of contention is that Breton emphasised the importance of the unconscious mind, automatic writing, and the exploration of dreams in the sense of a Freudian interpretation. Magritte, on the other hand, was more focused on logical paradoxes and the philosophical implications of perception and reality. As I said, he had a lifelong interest in philosophy. Also, Magritte was a reserved person and somewhat aloof, and this clashed with Breton, who was charismatic and a dominant personality. So as Magritte experienced a growing recognition, he started to manage his career independently, and that may have played a role in the separation from the Surrealists, as Breton saw himself as in control of the group and the one who decided about what Surrealism was and the one who decided its future. So, 1943, this is called The Forbidden World. Magritte stayed in Belgium during the German occupation, whereas André Breton fled to New York City, and that further split them apart. Of course, in Belgium, in Brussels, during the war, it was very difficult to make a living, particularly as the Nazis rejected what they called degenerate art, and Surrealism was one of those forms of art. So Magritte briefly adopted a colourful, painterly style between 1943 and 1947, roughly. It's an interlude known as his Renoir period, and he was reacting to feelings of alienation and abandonment that came from living in German-occupied Belgium. So this is a work from his Renoir period, a time when he was experimenting and exploring different artistic approaches and different subject matter. He was pushing the boundaries, trying new ideas. He did admit that at the time he was worried his surrealistic work could land him in a lunatic asylum, as he described it, because of the Nazis' view of what they called degenerate art. So these works he painted at the time are lighter, more luminous. Although, as you can see, it's a mermaid, the paintings remain surreal and feature familiar objects in unusual or fantastical contexts. One other work from this period, The Sea of Flames. Their hair takes on the form of flames juxtaposed against the opposing element, ancient element, I should say, water, shown in the background. The frog may symbolise transformation, or perhaps the hidden or the supernatural, all themes that challenge our sense of reality and perception. So this was painted in his Renoir period, and although it has brighter colours and a different sort of theme, it still has this surrealist element to it. Let's move on to 1952. The listening room. The room feels claustrophobic. It's filled with a gigantic apple. Now, the apple is typically a symbol associated with knowledge or temptation and sin, but Magritte might just be using it as an everyday object made incongruous. The title, The Listening Room, adds another layer of mystery, as the room appears to have nothing to do with listening. The room is filled with an apple, and outside what looks like the sea. There's no room left for listening, which implies a large open space in which the listener can relax. Now, Magritte wrote, "I take care as far as possible to make only paintings that arouse mystery with the precision and enchantment necessary for the life of ideas." I should also add, this is a painting from what's now known as his Vache or cow period, from 1948 to 1950, although this painting was 52. And during that time, he experimented again, deviated from his usual surreal style, was a bit more colourful, a bit more whimsical, brighter colours, more playful and less restrained. Incidentally, the name Vache or cow is a humorous term that Magritte himself used to reflect his more playful and satirical style. He was just coming out of a period when he supported himself during the war, and in fact towards the end of the 1930s, by producing, painting fake Picassos, Braques and de Chiricos. Later, in fact, for a brief period, he printed forged banknotes. This ended in about 1948, when he returned to the style and themes of his pre-war surrealistic art. This is Personal Values, again in 1952. He painted it for his dealer in New York, but the dealer rejected it because he said it made him feel disorientated, ill, and feeling sick, to which Magritte replied, "That's what a good painting should do." Gives us another insight into his motivations. Now, Personal Values is a typical surrealist painting. We see everyday objects which have been enlarged and juxtaposed in mysterious ways. There's a comb on the bed, a glass, a very large glass, a match, a bar of soap on the floor, and a shaving brush on the wardrobe. These are everyday objects, many associated with preparing for the day. The walls are covered with an image of a cloudy sky. And in fact, talking about objects like this, Magritte had a hobby. He collected everyday objects that fascinated him, and he often used these objects in his paintings to create these surreal juxtapositions. He collected small figures, strange trinkets, antique objects, and so on. Anything that took his fancy. He also said, everything in my works comes from the feeling of certainty that we belong, in fact, to an enigmatic universe. This is the Empire of Light, a very well-known painting, and there are 6 versions of this painting. It shows the daytime scene, daytime sky, I should say, above a nighttime scene below. The 6 versions, there's 2 in private collection, 1 in MoMA in New York City, 1 in Texas, 2 in Brussels. And they were produced between 1953 and 1961. And this is the first he painted in 1953, which is in the Musée Magritte in Brussels. And in 1950s, there was a period of growing international recognition for Magritte, and he started at last to become more successful in his 50s. His work was, or began to be, celebrated in the art world. He gained broader acclaim outside of Belgium. He participated in a number of important exhibitions in the 1950s. His work featured in major galleries and museums across Europe and the United States, and he began to be seen as a leading figure in Surrealism. About this time in the 50s was the development of pop art, and he was recognised as an influence on the pop artists, and that further increased his reputation as an influential artist. And his work also started to become used in advertising. And in fact, according to the 1998 documentary The Fear of God, 25 Years of the Exorcist, this iconic poster for the film was inspired by the Empire of Light. So that's one example of how his work started to influence a wide range of people, and how, as a result, he became known by many people outside of the art world. Also, at this time, he started to face health challenges. He became depressed, suffered from various illnesses, and to the extent that his health issues sometimes impacted his ability to work and to travel. Golconda is a painting with a seemingly endless array of men in bowler hats, all floating in a sky above a cityscape, dressed in identical suits and hats, giving them an uniform, almost robotic appearance, and they appear to be not falling but suspended in midair, creating this dreamlike effect. The name, incidentally, Golconda, he got from a poet friend, Louis Scuttenaire, who often helped him find names for his paintings. In this case, the name Golconda refers to a city in India, which was the centre of the diamond industry. And the city became so legendary that the name became a synonym for wealth. So, and incidentally, as a tribute to his friend, Magritte used his face for the man in the painting closest to the chimney on the right-hand side. We see 3 men in bowler hats standing beneath crescent moons. The men look similar. Maybe it's the same person at different times. They don't interact. The moon above each one of them is a symbol of mystery, dreams, and the subconscious. And the title is The Mysteries of the Horizon, which draws our attention to the horizon, which symbolically is implies limitless possibilities. And the painting makes us think of those limitless possibilities and therefore the limits of our knowledge, the mysteries of existence, and how subtle shifts in perspective can reveal new meanings. So the horizon becomes a metaphor for the enigmatic aspects of life and consciousness. By the way, Magritte himself enjoyed wearing a bowler hat and a suit, and incorporated them in his artwork. So in some ways, the bowler hat is a reference to himself, and this distinctive look became iconic. One of his more enigmatic paintings, referring to the German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Now, the umbrella is typically associated with protecting us from water, but this is contradicted by the glass of water. It's placed balanced on top of the umbrella, so we can imagine that as we pick up the umbrella, the glass falls over and drenches us. Now, Hegelian dialectic involves the conflict between opposing ideas or contradictions, which are then synthesized through dialogue to create a new concept. So it could be that Magritte is visually representing a philosophical paradox, the coexistence of opposites, the resolution of contradictions, central to Hegel's philosophy. And Magritte discussed these ideas with the philosopher and surrealist thinker and leader of the surrealists, André Breton. Despite their different views on surrealism, they did frequently exchange ideas and mutually respected each other, and both were intellectually curious. And although they had different views of surrealism, they often discussed and reflected on art and philosophy together, and were each mutually influenced by these interactions. The castle of the Pyrenees, a rock typically associated with heaviness, is shown floating above a sea, suggesting some desires and aspirations are beyond human reach. Maybe it evokes a sense of the sublime, where beauty and awe are intertwined with the impossibility of fully comprehending or achieving something. We see an isolated rock with a castle perched on top, maybe symbolising isolation. The castle, of course, is traditionally a symbol of protection and refuge, but it's now rendered inaccessible. It floats above the sea without any visible means of approach. The isolation could reflect emotional or existential detachment as the viewer contemplates the inaccessibility of certain places, certain emotions, or certain states of being. Another rock, this time ambiguous. It's not clear whether it's floating or resting on the cliff opposite. And in fact, the title gives another layer of meaning. The glass key suggests fragility and the ability to open something that's locked away. But there's no glass in the painting and no key. Is the rock intended to be a key to something? In fact, the title, The Glass Key, is the name of a famous novel by Dashiell Hammett, published in 1931. And the novel is a mystery centred around betrayal, murder and political intrigue. It's possible Magritte was inspired by this narrative to evoke a sense of mystery, tension and complexity, although I see no direct connection between the story and the painting. Which leads into another thing Magritte once said: the titles of the paintings are not explanations, and the paintings are not illustrations of the titles. So maybe we should just leave it like that. This is one of his most well-known, iconic and enigmatic paintings, The Son of Man. There's a man wearing a bowler hat, but his face is obscured by the apple. Is Magritte commenting on the way our true identity is always hidden? The man is well dressed, but faceless. Looking at it, I think of the photographs I've seen of thousands of bowler-hatted men walking across to work across London Bridge in the 1960s, anonymous and faceless in the modern world. Or possibly it's a biblical reference. The Son of Man could refer to Adam, who disobeyed God by eating the forbidden fruit often represented by an apple. It could therefore be a meditation on temptation, knowledge and sin, and the conflict between desire and prohibition. And adding to that, Magritte once said that this painting was a self-portrait. He said, "Everything we see hides another thing. We always want to see what is hidden by what we see." And I think that idea is central to this work, The Son of Man. The apple obscures the face. It teases the viewer with the desire to see beyond the hidden. We always want to see what is hidden, and everything we look at hides another thing. A statement about the nature of reality. Appearances can be deceptive. What we desire is always just out of reach. A woman is riding a horse through a forest. We see her in front of and behind the trees at the same time, possibly a comment on illusion and reality, the natural world and the human world, the fragmentary nature of reality. What we see is not always what is real, and we hardly ever see the full picture. The title, The Blank Signature, refers to something missing, possibly a blank in the creative process or something incomplete or waiting for its final form. Not only is one part of the horse missing, but the rear of the horse is shown behind a tree whose roots are shown behind the horse. He's playing with the nature of representation and the unreliable nature of perception and the complexity of reality. Finally, 1966, I end with Decalcomania, painted a year before he died. The title is a reference to a technique used by the Surrealists where what they do is spread paint on a surface and then press another surface onto that, creating a transfer or imprint, but one that is random and fragmented, which is not the technique used here. He has precisely painted, although painted something that is fragmented. We see a figure standing in front of a curtain, looking out over a distant seascape. Surely it's Magritte himself, because, as I said, at one time he wore a bowler hat, and the hat came to symbolise him. Is he saying farewell to us? As we've seen, he used surrealism and philosophy to challenge our perception of reality, and by placing everyday objects out of context, he forces us to question everyday truths and realities, such as the distinction between the object and its representation. It's a visual paradox. He's playing here with what's real and what's illusionary. He is at once transparent, enabling us to see the world clearly through him, and also solid and blocking the world from our view. As I said, it was one of his final paintings. He died of pancreatic cancer in 1967, aged 68, and is buried in Brussels. His wife, Georgette, died some 2 decades later in 1986, and she lived to see his reputation grow and grow, and his work become widely used in advertising, and his reputation further broadened. So, I'm showing you as a final image the Son of Man again as a representation of Magritte and one of his final works, formal and precise, but mysterious and unknowable. But I hope this talk has illuminated some aspects of his work, as he was a truly original artist. So thank you for your time and attention, and goodbye for now.